Hello, we're gonna get going. Welcome. I think this is a brilliant strategy to make sure that you fill the room, to make a smaller room for the conversation, and also it's a good way so the audience cannot see what we are discussing. So certainly, as you can see, I'm not Eric Moss. I think Andrew has the fortune or disgrace that I will be replacing him, and Eric is on vacation, so I got to do this. Couple of things I can promise you before we start. One, it's going to be shorter than the usual are. Second, I think it's not going to be as metaphysical and esoteric. I'm going to try to keep it more focused in certain things that are, to me, in a way, simple and straightforward questions when it comes to these kind of pieces. It's always like, it's an interesting topic to discuss because it's a genre of its own. It's not really art, it's not really architecture in traditional sense. It's somewhere in between. But I want to start in a little bit more cynical way, the conversation. I was reading your text today, which, by the way, if you try to read it, is incredibly difficult. And I realized for the first time in my life I may need glasses. But the text, which is a very clever and funny one, and I recommend all of you to read, one of the parts that you put that I found it was really interesting when you were saying the bio, the headshot, the blah, 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 right? And I wanted to ask you the other way around. What happened in the text? It says the bio, the headshot, the render, the title, all that usually get defeated by the piece in self-installation. What I want to ask you is, to start, what happened when the bio, the headshot, the render, the title, the credit doesn't get defeated by the work?
Well, I mean, for me, I guess the less cynical, the less cynical response to that question would be this. I mean, for me, those things were never. They were always let's say, incredibly specific, handled in the way that I think an architect might handle those things, and not in the way that. And no offense to the public relations department here, because they were great, but not in the way that PR people would handle those things, or let's say someone outside the discipline would typically write their own, would write the credits for an architecture installation, would write the bio for somebody, would make the video. These are things that I don't think we're in a position to take for granted. And so the answer to the question is something like this, which is not to say that all those things are in the room. They're certainly not in the gallery, and intentionally so. They're not in the. We didn't build a room to display them, but they're definitely part of the installation, and they're a crucial, and I would say, designed part. And so you get something that is specific in almost every way, or at least intentional, or at least its intentions are to be specific, which is a sort of weird place for me to be, having talked with a bunch of people here who know my work, where I've always dealt with or have been interested in abstraction, and in this case I tend to move towards things that are maybe slightly less abstract and more specific, like the way that the photograph is taken for the headshot, or the bio is written, or the statement is written, or the poster is done. Those things are very much a part of it, and this is what it looks like. I mean, it unfortunately, when you strip it down to that, you get a white room, currently.
Apparently, which is incredibly museum-like. The second question in relation to that, and I swear I'm not trying to be captious about it, is really, I've been seeing you for the last 2 months, and you and your team walking back and forth, sweating and whatever, and looking at the piece now. What took you so long to put it together? Because when I see it, and I say this as an opportunity because I want to know the specifics, because it seems that the result is not a reflection of the effort of the process. And that's something that interests me, particularly in the summer when we are discussing thesis. I'm interested in the relation. That's what I'm saying. It's not really a bad blood question.
Yeah.
It's an interesting one. I want to talk about the relation between the process and the result.
Right.
And if the result is the process, or the installation was you guys doing it, or the installation is a piece that is there.
What took so long was decisions not solely based on adding more things, meaning a lot of the work that was done had nothing to do with building more stuff. It had to do with taking shit out. That takes a lot of time, actually, to make those decisions and think about those sorts of things. The decision to delete or erase or reduce, I think in the last 15 years, we oftentimes don't think about those decisions. Any kind of editing is seen, or as I would say, has often been seen as something that maybe doesn't take so long. But when you start to quibble about exactly what should go in a gallery, exactly where certain things might be placed, things that are literally sit on the sort of periphery of both the room, or just say sort of conceptually of what it means to install your own work, that shit takes a lot of time. And so we've been running around moving stuff in and out and moving things around. We moved the fans probably 6 times. And daisy chained them and blew fuses and did all that stuff. So those things, that's what we've been doing. We've been quibbling.
Because it's okay. That was part of, that was designed too?
Yeah, yeah.
Because I know that there is a series of new artifacts here and extra stuff that been added, so I thought that maybe the sound is part of it. The relation, part of the question in relation to that was because now that you mentioned that, I always thought that the best definition of minimalism that I ever heard was from Cosmo Kramer from Seinfeld. And there was an episode that he was giving away everything in his apartment. And Seinfeld asked him, "What are you doing?" "I'm becoming a minimalist." And I always thought that was an interesting idea, but I would argue that the work that we see on the other side of the wall, I would say is much more what I would call a notion of maximalism. A sense of it's using a lot of effects that come from minimalism, but it's not done through the techniques or methodology of the minimalism. Will that be fair, or?
Yeah. No, I think clearly there are all sorts of references, some intentional and some, despite my best efforts, not intentional. But it isn't, I don't think that one can look at it as a minimalist piece. I mean, people have described it as a porn set, a casino, and a number of other things. I don't think any of those things have to
They have a vivid imagination. They don't go to the same casinos that I go.
But I think that when you can push a lot of stuff to the periphery, and you can let's say make things or pull things to the level of to the point where you begin to question them as participating in the architecture, and there can be a lot of those things. I mean, you pointed out the grates and the sort of marginal stuff that typically occupies walls that we tend to ignore. Some of them are real and some of them aren't, but they've all been specifically placed, and there's a lot of them. And that's not a minimalist move. That is for sure a maximalist move, but it's meant to teeter just on the edge of, let's say, recognition, so that someone thinks that. So someone comes in and questions the placement or the placement, let's say, of the thing, the outlet, or the placement of an object in relationship to that thing. So the fans are completely organized by the location of a socket on that thing, right? They couldn't go anywhere else because of the socket of where they are. So those sorts of things are not minimalist. There's nothing about them that is, and there's tons of stuff over there. Some of it I put there and some of it I didn't. And I hope everyone notices all that stuff.
Well, I think I noticed some of them. I cannot guarantee I noticed all of them. One thing also that intrigues me was based on the work that I know you've been doing your own and with the students and so on, there always has been an incredibly level of boredom. There's always a fine line between obsession and just craziness in relation with the treatment of geometry and your obsession, which this piece seems to be pretty empty of that. it doesn't seem to have any kind of, at least obvious or direct relationship with that kind of obsession for the excess of geometrical understanding of lines in a space. There was, am I missing something there? There is something I don't see of it's completely intentional to work in a completely different aspect, because in that way I would say it seems almost like a commentary on your own work, which seems like a strange thing to do.
I think, well, when we set out to work on the gallery, the first thing we did, they send you a package to Rhino model and set of plans. And the first thing that we did was I mean, what probably can best be described as a kind of dumb geometric analysis of those drawings. Searching for and searching out regulating lines and let's say latent organizations in the room. And those things are embedded in what you see. And the drawings, in some cases, are actually literally instantiated on the walls, especially the far wall. So those things are in it, and they're definitely in aspects of the installation that aren't in the room, like the construction drawings, especially the sort of conceptual and the schematic drawing sets. I mean, we produced a full set of drawings for this almost as a kind of test for ourselves. And in those, you'll find those sorts of geometric relationships and that obsession with lines and line work. It just doesn't always instantiate itself, or doesn't always sort of find itself built into the room itself, but certainly help to make, and sometimes even intuitively or sort of subconsciously place certain things in relationship to it. I mean, this wall is a result of that, for instance.
Okay. Okay. I don't know. It's kind of a weird thing. It's like. Again, my interest or my question has to do with much more simple things that maybe some of, and we will have time for Q&A. Some people can ask you some more esoteric thing, but I'm more obsessed. Like, for example, how important or deliberate was that the edge of the pedestals is very uneven? Was that by design, or this just poor craftsmanship?
That was by. I mean, it depends. Well,
no,
the wiggle in the pedestals is something that we've talked a lot about as we came to grips with them. Let's say. So, first of all, the guys who built them are SCI-Arc alumni. I don't know if they're here, and they did it. And they did those pedestals under enormous time and budgetary constraints.
It was an opportunity for you to say it was done on purpose.
No,
it's the moment.
But what happened is that there's a moment when we came to terms with the wiggle. I mean, and we talked about it, and this is maybe some of the stuff that you saw when Aaron and Mark and I were running around trying to figure things out. One, it becomes a lighting issue, and I've learned more about the placement of lights than I ever thought I cared to. It's very much dependent on the light. The other thing is that there was something that was nice about them in a way, and this is something that I would say designed in the way that you design when you discover something and you begin to come to terms with or conceptualize it. So the wiggle allows a thing to move from, let's say, something that appears to be monolithic at the top to something that's clearly a surface as it moves to the bottom, and in some cases begins to hover. And that ambiguous relationship with the ground, that it takes a kind of sloping to the ground, but then is then offset 3 inches, was completely intentional. And so that the wiggle reveals that even more, doesn't bother me so much. And so I don't think it's so much a kind of lack of craftsmanship as a series of other factors that go into these things. But with anything, you begin to come to terms with it and you begin to construct an argument about it, or you fix it. And we very consciously kept it.
Okay. This, now we're gonna get, I don't know if this is more esoteric, but it's something that, because in a strange way, one of the fundamental questions I have in my mind always, every time that a piece is revealed in the gallery, and I may be wrong, but my sense is most of the people who done one, which many are here, think about it is, I always have the impression that when you get to do an architecture installations, I think there are many options, but bottom line, they came to make, I would argue, to most 2 or 3 possible options. One is you see the installation as an opportunity to become like a petri dish or almost a biopsy of an architecture idea that you can figure it out and then it can be scaled up or put outside and it will become a full-fledged piece of architecture. The other one is became a piece by himself. So it's really in that kind of a crossover war between an art piece and architecture piece because it was done by an architect, thought as an architecture problem, movement of people, proportion, and so on. But it's the thing by himself. And the third one, I would say, is when it becomes more like a commentary or a critique of particular moment of a particular section of time in the disciplinary discussion. I have my own opinion about where your piece lands, but I'm interested to see if the intention when you start to work on it remain the same when the thing is done, or how you see that in relation to those, or maybe there is a fourth or fifth scenario that I'm not mentioning that you consider into it.
I mean, I won't shy away from the category. I think we agree on the category, and we've talked about the category that this probably exists in, and that commentary is the wrong word. Critique is, or to be critical is not a word that I've shied away from, at least for a couple of years. And I think, I would hope, let's say, that this sits in that category. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One is when a lot of when you and other colleagues and faculty and other people here who had a chance to do their installation, it was I can say it was a very different time. There have been things written and we have been exposed to as a discipline, specifically in this school and in this city, that have been themselves very critical of the role of the installation as a kind of, as having any real agency within the discipline. So to be a young architect who has never really, hasn't built much outside of installations, to be confronted with that when the people that were your instructors didn't necessarily face that particular boundary, for me was an interesting question. So that's not to say that there weren't other problems, but I would, based on recent developments in the discourse of architecture, it's a kind of challenge to be asked to do a pavilion or an installation. So my question, or the question that I asked, was quite literally, well then what is the agency of an installation given what we've been presented now? And that's what this is. And so to call it critical is just to say, well, what are the sort of limits of knowledge that these things might produce for us now, as opposed to what they were capable of doing 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, even 2 years ago. And so and that's basically what this is. What would it be? What would an installation be now? And you start with things like contracts and sort of required deliverables, literally the things that are legally, when you sign the contract to do it, what are those things? And then you just begin to look around and you begin to work on each one of those things in parallel. And that's sort of what this is. And that's what in the text I talk about with the sort of bio, the headshot, the video, all of that stuff, that maybe the installation or the pavilion becomes a site not necessarily of sort of prototyping things, but it becomes a place where we might begin to sort of figure out exactly what, or different, let's say, things that we've oftentimes cast away that we now might begin to regain or reclaim as architects. So making the video becomes a kind of important part. And that's not new in the video that I made. Certainly isn't even that original, but I made it. And I think I wrote all these other things. And so to be critical is literally to examine the kind of limits of something, and that's what this tries to do. What are those limits? What's included? What's not? What's a part of it? What's not? So it is critical. And the reason why it's critical is because it asks those questions.
Okay, let's say for a second that I buy that. Let's say for a second that we agreed to buy that. I mean, it sounds clever, but I think that to be. I hate the word clever. I hate the notion of clever in architecture, and I tell you the first reaction when I saw the piece complete is that it's one of those clever pieces. And the problem I have with clever is I think clever more often than not, which I think sometimes critical and clever go together, sometimes they don't. But the problem I have with clever, and again, you will have the chance to defend for it or not, is I think sometimes clever doesn't stand for anything. So I understand the argument so far that you've been telling me. it's not clear to me what the piece stands for it, or what it stands for represents your larger view of what architecture is today. So that's what I'm saying. I'm maybe misreading it as a clever piece. Maybe it's not clever. I don't think it's clever in terms of the complexity of, or I'm not talking about clever in terms of the architectural behavior. I'm talking about clever in the notion of the critique. But as I say, sometimes clever seems, and again, I'm not ready to call the judgment to say that that's what you did. But sometimes clever seems to be, to me, like a too easy way out to don't take a stand of a position, which it seems to me also something that's becoming too fast of a trend. Like we choose a clever way to don't take a stand, or to, not individually, but the piece of the work. Do you think that the work stands for something, or is just clever?
When I was a student, one of my very first instructors told me that clever was the worst thing you could be as an architect. So I've always taken that to be a great insult. As I began to work on this thing,
so this is the moment for you to shine.
I know exactly. That's why I brought it up. I know exactly where you stand on that term, and I've always felt the same way. And then as I began to work on the piece, and whether I don't know, it's difficult for me to what it stands for. I think I've tried to be quite clear about where I think it stands. But to react to the clever comment, so.
No, I think you've been very clear in what it critiques. Yeah. I don't think you've been very clear yet in what it stands for.
I think I would say not what it. I don't know what it's. I guess I don't know what it stands for. I know where it stands, and it stands, or at least it attempts to stand, sort of. Let's say like. Very much in my current position, in my struggle with the work, and with the work of the people that I respect. And those people, for better or worse, sometimes aren't architects. And that to me is incredibly troubling. And so it tries to get away a little bit from some of that stuff, okay? But just, and I don't want to avoid that question, but just to talk about the clever thing a little bit, as I began to work on this and began to share this with the people who know a lot about me and who know a lot about my work, and especially people like Anna Niemark, who's my partner, and it didn't do this with me, but clearly has heavily influenced the project and others. They continue to refer back to that word in almost everything that I showed them, and so and then I looked up the definition, and the definition didn't seem so insulting. It's basically like it has something to do with intelligence. So I don't take. I guess I've come to grips with that as my own baggage associated with that term, and my own knowledge about how people that I respect view that term. But if people want to think of it as clever and dismiss it as a result, I guess that's not my problem. I guess I've come to embrace it because people I greatly respect have called it clever, and I think they think that's a good thing. So.
You haven't told me for what it stands for.
It stands.
You give me a clever answer to the clever, but and I want to get back to that in a second. But
I mean, this is what it's. I guess I don't know. It's such a weird. It stands for this. I think this is my answer right now. Is that I have become increasingly interested in what we share, or what our conventions are, standards are, or what are the sort of high fidelity things that we all operate with as a discipline. And I'm interested in those things. And I think that in the last 10 years, the post-critical project has destroyed any real understanding of what those shared, I don't care what the term is you want to describe them, values, ethics, morals, like drawing standards, whatever. But in the effort to kind of like project out, we've very much lost, at least in my view, or at least my generation's view or my friend's view, a sense of what's in the center of the discipline. And this thing tries to make a claim for, or tries to stand for those things, or tries to reclaim those things. Like, what is it that specifically that we do when someone asks us to do an installation? What are the requirements? What are its conventions? What are its sort of characteristic methods? What are those things? And I'm interested in all cases in arguing for us to never ever give up those things like rendering or making the video or any of that stuff that we seem to just cast off. The placement of a electrical outlet, I don't think we should give up those things. And that's what this stands for. It stands for, it's about control and controlling those things. I mean, this space is designed specifically to have a talk and a...
Okay, but if that's so, what do you need the pedestals for?
I don't, actually. I want to take them out. I swear to God. I hate them.
Okay.
No, I mean, I think
I think you should hate them. I think it's the right reaction.
Yeah. No, I think they're well built, and I think we needed to put them in.
To realize that they shouldn't be there.
Yeah. I mean, if in the text it says like have you done enough or is it too much? And I think the pedestals signify one, first something outside the discipline. Pedestals are something that belong to the discipline of art, and the other thing that they signify is a kind of emptiness or a blankness, and that there's nothing that sits on top of them. With that said, so I think they're necessary to sort of get that concept or idea across, but the second that we put them in there, or even when we started to build them in the director's studio, the first question that came up was, can I leave them over there? And we decided to put them in, and we're going to take them out.
Okay. So you are becoming Cosmo Kramer. So in that case, I think a couple of the questions I have in relation to it. Now that we're going to take it out, I don't think the notion of a scale or why they're all the same, all the thing that matters anymore, because you're going to take them out.
Well, we can talk about those things. I mean,
if you want.
They're big.
Yeah. But the part I hate the most is I know they're going to be floating in SCI-Arc for the next 5 years. We're going to see them in review, be moving around.
You want to know why?
They're going to be used for models in pin-ups.
They can't be.
They're going to be around for a long fucking time.
You want to know why that's not true?
Why?
Because they cannot come out of this room except in pieces. And those things don't come apart easily. So.
Okay, that's fair. One thing, this is kind of a more strange one, but I think there is something interesting about for some weird reason, and this is a pure emotional gut reaction to the work. When I was looking into it, I was ambivalent trying to define if the project of the logic of this was either about pleasure or enjoyment, about the process of doing it. And it was something that struck to me that there was something strange about that, like the things were trying in a way to produce some sort of a pleasure quality to it. But then at the same time, I think it was much more about the enjoyment of the process, and the pleasure of what it comes out, it became sort of irrelevant.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if the work has that quality to be talked in terms of the emotional. Maybe it never aspired to that, but it's certainly something about the choreograph of the white and so on, and that in a way tried to produce some sort of emotional reaction. But I may be misreading that, and maybe the pieces are completely to be emotionless.
Yeah, I think.
But I don't know if that's something that you're interested in discuss or not.
Yeah, I mean, this is, to be able to do something like this is obviously, someone like me takes a great deal of pleasure in doing it. It was something that I spent a lot of time on and enjoyed doing quite a bit, just because of the conversations that it engendered with tons of people, and the ideas that came out of it, and I think some of the things that the projects that will continue from this that are now very much created by this and still in their very early stages. So it's a luxury, and it's been like a real pleasure to do it, and I mean that sincerely. And there's certainly a kind of selfish aspect to it. In terms of it, it's, let's say, what it seeks to express, or one should find in it. I'm less comfortable talking about like how people, the emotional response that people might have to it, but it's certainly. I gave a lecture like a year and a half ago. I don't know if Mohammed is here. I saw him earlier, and he used the word deadpan to describe my delivery, and
Sorry, what was it?
Deadpan. And I think this.
Sorry, my English is limited.
It basically means to act with a blank expression. And so the idea of blankness comes out of a critique I don't know exactly how Muhammad meant that comment, but I've looked into that word, and I think this seeks to be, in some cases, have blankness is a term that I used in the text, and this seeks to have not be expressionless, but a kind of blank or almost neutral expression, and that is probably not what's happened over there, based on how other people have experienced it, but I would say it was the intent. That my sort of railing against the sort of sensation project, I think I've come to the point where I think that it's impossible to completely eradicate it, but I want to make it as weak as possible or suppress it. So the piece is utterly meant to be a kind of deadpan, blank, expressionless thing.
I have two more questions before then we open to Q&A, and then we can make it a little bit more maybe dynamic. But one is a kind of a simpler one. Why the carpet has a metal edge?
We had two choices. When you go with carpet that cheap, you can either they can well, one, I could have put a fringe on it, which was suggested. That's one way it could have ended. We didn't do that. The other one is they can basically fold it over, or they can create a very distinct line, and that line was something that I was interested in. And watching people struggle with stepping onto the carpet is something I'm interested in observing tonight. And so not only is there a kind of threshold above, but there's a threshold below, and you very much have to step onto it and over that line. So that's what the metal edge is for. It's not meant to disappear or blend. It's literally supposed to force one to make a decision about walking onto the carpet, and also about whether they're going to take their shoes off, or whether they're going to leave their shoes on, or whether they're going to put the white supplied booties that are over there as well. All of those things, I don't care how one wants to walk on the carpet, but I think it forces you into a decision, and the metal line is part of that decision.
Sort of related to that, the last one I have in this round, and probably with the Q&A came up, something else will come to mind. One of the things that I was intrigued by was, based on my knowledge of your work through lectures and so on, it seems to me that your work always has been a fairly logical one, in terms of there's a very clear, rigorous, borderline, no margin for improvisation logic into it. Fair and unfair, but it looks a little bit like that. And it seems to me that this piece and so on, it doesn't seem to be part of that ethos. It seems to be that there was some kind of other level of productive or unproductive second guessing into the logic. It doesn't seem to be a piece that emanates from that. So I wonder how you conciliate a logic of working with the logic of a final deployment of something. Like when are those moments? I think to me that's an interesting question in relation to the process of thesis that we're going through. When is the moment that the religiosity, for the lack of a better word, of the methodology is not enough, and something else needs to be tweaked or changed and so on, and how that happened? Maybe I'm completely wrong, and you tell me, no, this actually is a perfect expression of a process. It's hard to believe, but it may be the case. So, and how you negotiate that?
Yeah, the question is a good one, only because I think this project forces me to come to terms with the distance between the way that I've worked before and then the way that I worked in this project, because there were very much things that happened or changed on the fly and didn't come out of, let's say, a kind of, for lack of a better term, a kind of auto-generative process based on, logic or systems. Not that I've always worked that way, but I certainly have mined the depths of those things or searched those things out to give me certain answers. I haven't always done that, and I haven't always asked my students to do that, but it's certainly something that's kind of embedded in my own work and the way that I was taught. This changes that for me, I think, in some fairly drastic ways, and it goes back to one of your earlier questions, is like, what were you doing for so long? Well, I definitely wasn't doing drawings all the time, and we were in here figuring out and changing things on the fly that didn't have to do with necessarily things that were based on a geometric logic, but seem more in tune with a kind of conceptual logic or something. But oftentimes those things were just made because it was a kind of, it was intuition. I mean, it was a kind of understanding of what it meant to build something this big and at this scale. And then obviously that process for me isn't over because of the challenge I have with the pedestals and thinking that they sort of breach the wall into the area of doing too much in the gallery based on what I wanted to do. So the process continues for me. I mean, it isn't necessarily one based on systems or geometry. It's one based on, for lack of a better term, a kind of conceptual understanding of the project and a kind of intuition based on that.
I have a couple other ones, but I'll get back to the end. I mean, maybe now is a good time to open it to somebody from the audience and from the cheap seats up there. Talk to him, and he's the elitist who wanted to have this VIP, a small room. If anybody has any questions. Pale. The fellow in the yellow shirt.
I was hoping not to ask the first question.
Well, that's your job, baby.
But I want to ask a question about geometry. Because mostly I looked at it very quickly, and I read it as quickly as I could. And just given the discussion of kind of constraints and assumptions and expectations, et cetera, it's funny because it does, well, first of all, I would say I like it, but I'm troubled by its cynicism. And so I would say, for instance, it's super specific, like all the geometry of it is very specific, the way that it kind of plays off of the existing room. You know, so I look at the symmetry that you create against the major and minor orders of the room, the way that you avoid all of the major axes of the room, but kind of play up the incredibly minor axes of the room. I get the games with the outlet covers and the vents and all of that stuff. And all of them seem to work to destabilize an organization that I don't think anybody has a problem with, that doesn't seem to push back. Like the organization of the room doesn't strike me as a constraint. And so to take its syncopated rhythms and fuck with them in the way that you have, in a way that is quite clever, actually. The way, you know, you kind of turn the directions and you move the things and you work off the mullion lines and the edges as opposed to the centers. And all, like, I get all that. But I guess my question would be, what do I get in return for getting it?
Well, it depends on what you. The answer to that question would be that you get the satisfaction of actually of looking closely and understanding something that, or understanding forces or ideas that are at play. I mean, the whole point of this, or I would say a big point of this, in a term that's been used a lot in this school, both in sort of pejorative ways and not, is the idea of close reading. And so the fact that you would notice those things, Todd, doesn't mean that this has not to do with close reading. This has to do with looking closely. And I think, like, the fact that you notice that the outlets are fake, or that there's things have been done with the paint on the walls, or all of this other stuff, means that you can never completely understand all of it all at once. It never is going to consume you. It has nothing to do with a kind of all-consuming affect. You have to look around a little bit. And so, what do you get by noticing it? Well, one, I think you understand at least the agency of some of those things, that the way that the layers of paint on the wall are something that you can use as a kind of act of design. I think that's important. The other thing that you get is just like what I said, which is just the sort of importance of actually examining something from both 6 inches away as opposed to 30 feet away.
Hey, Andrew, this is Wes. I'm outside the room.
Where are you, Wes? Wes, you're sounding like the voice of God.
Yes, this is Wes.
So I have to admit that I was quite interested in Hernan's line of questioning, particularly trying to nail Andrew down to...
Sorry, can somebody tell Stephanie West that it's impossible to hear what he's saying?
Really? Louder. Okay.
Come in.
I'm standing right next to the...
come to the door.
I have to watch Jack out here. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
sorry. I'm getting feedback from the speaker back here. So I was saying that I was interested in Hernan's line of questioning as he tried to tie Andrew down to a particular point or direction in this. And he at the end of the discussion, Andrew talks a little bit about the fact that he was working not auto-generatively, but more critically, and these may be my interpretations of these words. And I have to say that words matter in a hair-splitting, precise project like this with such exquisite exactitude in the sorts of arrangements and placements of things. So I think a discussion of the difference between what you mean when you say critique versus commentary would be important and enlightening, and I would expect it could be supported at great length. But the point I wanted to make is that, you know, as a sort of post-critical hipster critique, which is sort of how I would read it, and that may or may not be fair, I am reminded from my own efforts in this vein back in the 90s before it was post-critical or hip, that critique always needs a host, and that at the end of the day, it always raises the question, again, that I think Hernan was trying to ask, which is what is the architecture at the end of this exercise? In the sense, what does it stand for? Does it stand for an architecture or simply operations and refinements of some existing condition? I was surprised not to see, for example, cut styrofoam or some of these other projects that you're maybe better known for, earlier projects, that clearly were a project or a program in the way I think Hernan was searching for before. I'm totally behind the interest in close reading or paying attention, though I am also interested in what the difference between those might be for you. But I'm wondering at the end, what are we paying attention to if it's more than simply reacquainting ourselves with the possibility of conventions and reading itself or attention itself?
Well, I think it stands exactly for those things, and I think it is in some cases not a return, but like an anxiety on my part of just things that weren't part of the set of received ideas that my generation was given by the generation of instructors. I don't know if anyone can hear me, but anyway, it deals very much with those questions, and it doesn't. For me, it's like in terms of like what the architecture is. I have my opinions, and other people might have theirs, but it asks those questions, and it's not shy about saying that it's simply right now, what for me like meant to sort of push all of the sort of peripheral things that seem to have been taken for granted, and that has to do with the outlets as much as it has to do with writing your own bio, to the point of the sort of creation of taste or the production of culture, and the capacity of architecture to do all those things. And that's what this project stands for, and that's what it tries to do. There's a whole host of other things about the design of the room that I think we could talk about, and Todd hit on them a little bit, but I think it tries very seriously to take on those para things quite seriously. And that's what this is about for me, and the ability for architecture to handle all that stuff, not just the sort of creation of a large autonomous object that sits in the middle of a white room. And that to me is a quite powerful statement for architecture's capacity to do things other than that, and that's what this is about.
Do you imagine it as model or something, or exemplary in that way?
Yes. Yeah, I can, but I like for me to define that for you right now. I mean, there's a whole set of ideas that have I've tried to ask with this thing, and I can't get.
I mean, I'm totally sympathetic. I mean, I feel very comfortable with all the stuff and everything, but again, let's say within the context of the school here, beyond the small lessons and you may quibble with whether they're small or not, but beyond the small lessons the students might take in or through paying attention, do you not have the sense that you have to have something to start with? So the question is, where do you get that something to start with?
For me, I started with my understanding of the sort of genre of architecture installations. That's what this works with, and that's what it works on, which is a very different thing than doing a house or producing even a kind of architecture with a capital A in some cases.
Right. So the distinction would be, say, between installations and architecture.
Yeah.
Then it could be read
architectural installations or architecture installations and architecture. I mean, I think we can and should quibble about the distinction between those two things. And this starts from the position of a kind of what is my understanding of an architecture installation.
Right. So it would be cool, let's say, if it were a standalone thing, not in a room, out in the parking lot or something, at which point then the question becomes a little more open, right, because now it doesn't have the room to operate on,
right,
but it's working ex novo.
But it still operates on a set of conventions that are assumed that I think aren't specific to this room. This thing operates on things that are specific to this room, and then things that are specific to a genre. And I think that these things can be taken outside of this room quite easily if asked to do another installation.
Right. I guess, so again, the interest becomes at this point in time where we are interested in how to generate stuff as opposed to just refine or tweak or critique it, again, presuming there's a host to operate on.
Well, I certainly think that this does more than just refine. I think this adds. It does a whole bunch of other things. It's very much invested in like positive acts of architecture.
I'm not.
I'm sort of. I think I understand where you're going, and I want people to not think of this. There isn't. I know that it's easy to find cynicism in this, but there's a very kind of positive.
No. I think your statement of deadpan is better, which I don't necessarily find cynical. I just find it limited, which is entirely its intention, I suppose. And I'm not trying to say that that's a bad thing, but I'm wondering what is beyond that limited, let's say. Maybe that's not a fair question to ask in this situation. But it's like, wow, this is pretty cool. What's next? And I don't mean in your personal development or anything, but in the trajectory that's begun with this kind of work.
Well, whilst the people keep thinking, another question to ask, I want to go back to start to wrapping this up. We have another 5 minutes or so you can go enjoy the party. You mentioned that part of the exercise was to try to go, not to go back, but try to reivindicate certain fundamental disciplinary qualities that it seems to be lost with the post-critical discourse. Probably I'm misusing the words, but I think you mentioned something along those lines. Two things I want to ask you or comment in relation to that. It have to do with, one is why that would be important, because it seems to be that our discipline is one of those that are obsessed with that. With most of other disciplines will not be so obsessed with that. Most other disciplines will accept the evolution of things and things change, and there are certain things that they don't need to visit. But let's say for the sake of the argument that those are things worth revisiting and rethinking and revalorize, what are the antidotes that you use to the thing to don't become an exercise of nostalgia? And the reason I want to talk about the notion of nostalgia is something I'm riffling on from the heretics and all the other things that we involve. In the Greek, when the Greeks were sailing and so on, nostalgia was one of the illness that you will get. And if you get nostalgia, you will be killed and thrown into the water because you became useless for that adventure. So my question is, how we can operate within that without becoming nostalgic about it. And again, I'm not saying that the piece is nostalgic, but I'm saying that is maybe too open of an argument that it can be interpreted for that side. And maybe you're okay with nostalgia.
I think that if I don't aim to be nostalgic at all. The answer to the question is that I think there's a lot of really great things that came out of the post-critical project. I'm critical of that only because I now have the luxury to be critical of it. And so now as we return to certain things that we might have forgotten, or we begin to look inward as opposed to out, to just create a kind of very simple diagram of it, we might find different things in there, that architects have actually discovered a whole host of other tasks that we're involved in that we can take control over and we can own as a discipline. And so it has nothing to do with the kind of the lack of the post-critical project to produce things. Clearly I think it had its moment and it did a lot of really great things. Now as we sort of return to or look at the kind of hole in the center, what might be in there? And I think you find a lot of different things. You find architects making movies and doing all of this other stuff. And I think we could now begin to be critical about the potential of those things to actually have agency within the discipline. And so it isn't like the post-critical project gave us all those things. Now let's just look at them a little bit more critically, to put it bluntly.
Okay. This will be last question.
Well, that wasn't my intention, but I have like a two-part question. One is related to the whole critical aspect. And let's say if you were just to conflate simplistically, probably, and you don't have to agree with this into a kind of minimalist category, would you think that being a minimalist today would actually be a critical project at that level? I mean, if you take this out of context, meaning the context of SCI-Arc or Los Angeles, it would perfectly fit into somebody where the whole compositional aspects, the issues of proportion, relation of material to edge, finishes, and so on. I mean, all the genre of conditions that have made minimalism a certain, even a cliche, sometime during the 90s. So I'm saying, I understand what you're saying, but it necessitates this sort of close reading and the textual understanding of the author in order to be fully read. And the second part is that if that's the intention, would you have been okay with doing this thing as an experiment that would have been completely closed off the walls, and the only thing we have ever seen would be just your photos, your representations of it, and not like, get a little bit of the feedback that you were just describing about people going into the carpet or not, or situations like that?
No. No to both questions. I don't think it's minimalism. I think it does things that are in the antithesis of minimalism. It expresses things in the most maximal way, and so I don't know the degree that a minimalist project has any real capacity to be critical of anything, frankly. I think you'd have to find different terms. At least I feel like I'd have to find different terms. The answer to the other question is the sort of documentation or the display of that documentation, which is clearly, let's say, a part of the installation, not in the gallery. And the distinction between those two things are quite important to me. Those things are available on the internet or wherever it is that those things typically are, and people should look at them and think of them as a part of this thing. But we made a very conscious decision not to make it, or not to put those things in the installed work. And so that the distinction between all of those things and that last question is very, very important.
Okay, so thank you everybody for coming. You should have dressed all in white.
Yeah, I should have. Can I just say, I just wanted to say thanks to a couple people. Can I do that? No one cares, but one, Alley 36 Collaborative built the pedestals, and they were great, and I mentioned them earlier. There's a couple other people, Aaron Bessler and Mark Achari, who worked for me, who were amazing, and they were the people running around while we were changing our minds.
This is not the Oscars,
and then other people are on the wall, so check it out.
This is not the Oscars, right?
Yeah, I know. Okay. You need to give a shout out to your people.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everybody. Bye.